I never expected glass to become a problem. When people talk about architectural mysteries, they usually point underground. Buried cities, lowered streets, entire floors swallowed by earth. Or they argue about impossible construction schedules, railroads built too fast, stone structures raised in decades that should have taken centuries. Compared to that, windows felt insignificant, decorative, superficial. A stylistic footnote, not a structural question, until I started paying attention, not casually, not in passing, but deliberately. That's when the scale stopped making sense. 4-story windows in public buildings officially completed in the 1870s. Glass surfaces taller than modern apartment blocks, openings so wide they rival industrial hangar doors. And these weren't crude experiments or isolated monuments. They were everywhere, installed with surgical precision, perfect symmetry, identical proportions repeated across entire facades. These weren't holes cut into walls. They were the walls. I first noticed it while studying early photographs of civic buildings in northern Italy, Turin specifically. I was comparing late 19th century images to modern restorations when something stood out in the original photographs. The windows weren't simply oversized, they were structural. Iron lattices embedded directly into load-bearing stone. Glass surfaces framed not as decoration, but as integral elements of weight distribution. The mullions weren't ornamental. They followed rigid geometric patterns, repeating ratios that looked engineered, not styled. Stress paths, load channels, designs you'd expect from modern material science, not from an era supposedly still relying on brick, rivets, and guesswork. The year stamped on the photograph, 1864. This was decades before reinforced concrete, before standardized steel beams, before electric lighting became practical. And yet these buildings were designed as if light itself was a primary structural and functional component. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Vienna, Buenos Aires, Stockholm, Quebec City, different climates, different political systems, different architects separated by oceans and languages. And yet the same windows appeared again and again. Same height, same proportions, same iron cross-sections, same arch curvature. As if the plans hadn't evolved locally, as if they had been distributed. Official explanations point to fashion, the prestige of light-filled halls, industrial optimism, wealthy governments flaunting progress. But fashion doesn't behave like this. Trends mutate. They adapt to budgets and materials. They degrade as they spread. This didn't. This remained mathematically consistent. The deeper I looked, the stranger the pattern became. Universities, opera houses, national archives, customs buildings, railway terminals, museums, administrative centres, postal headquarters, all constructed between roughly 1820 and 1910, all featuring glass openings between 17 and 26 feet tall, all maintaining similar glass-to-stone ratios, all built with iron frameworks whose profiles match across continents with unnerving precision. Take just a few examples. Madrid's early postal headquarters, completed in 1889, featured windows over 21 feet tall. Lima's Palacio de Justicia, begun in the late 1800s, used nearly identical proportions. Cape Town's old government buildings, same story. Even Osaka's early Western-style institutions mirrored the same ratios, despite Japan supposedly being newly exposed to European architecture at the time. Different empires, same blueprint. Why? Why would architects who never met, working decades apart, independently converge on the same specifications? Why insist on flooding interiors with overwhelming amounts of light? Why dedicate so much material, labor, and cost to glass when stone would have been cheaper, stronger, and easier? The standard explanation collapses under scrutiny, and that's when a word history tried to erase begins to resurface. Before dismissing this as speculation, look at the maps. Not medieval fantasies. Official cartography. Government-issued atlases from the 1700s and early 1800s. Vast regions across Eurasia labeled with a name that no longer exists in modern textbooks. A civilization described not as a myth, but as a functioning geopolitical entity. Contemporary encyclopedias described its cities, trade systems, and architectural traditions. Diplomatic correspondence referenced its territories. Trade routes crossed through its domains. And then, within a single century, the references vanish. The name disappears. The territory is rebranded, the narrative reorganized around empires we recognize today. But architecture doesn't vanish as easily as ink. Those enormous windows appear most frequently during the same decades. Those references were being quietly removed. The style they represent doesn't cleanly belong to Gothic, neoclassical, or Victorian traditions. It's too uniform, too advanced, too globally synchronized. This doesn't look like a trend. It looks like inheritance. And then there's the practical problem everyone avoids: glass. In the 19th century, producing large, flat, distortion-free glass was slow, expensive, and fragile. Transporting it across oceans was risky. Installation required extreme precision. Even a minor miscalculation could shatter months of labor. Before industrial plate glass became widespread in the 1850s and 1860s, a single 20-foot window required assembling dozens of smaller panes, each cut, ground, and fitted by hand. The iron frameworks had to be forged to exact tolerances. Weight distribution had to be calculated without modern engineering software. Thermal expansion had to be accommodated. Wind loads considered. All without computers, without standardized materials, without reliable communication between continents. Now multiply that by thousands. Buildings like national libraries and grand terminals installed massive windows, not over decades, but in a few compressed years. Budgets that don't align with the scale. Construction timelines that make no logistical sense. Contractor records that list small local firms for projects that would have required international expertise. As if the real builders weren't meant to be named. Or remembered, which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. What if those windows weren't decorative? Many of them are oriented with extreme precision, east-west alignments, south-facing facades, geometric arrangements that funnel light into specific interior zones, central halls, reading rooms, assembly spaces, courtrooms, not random, calculated. Inside, surfaces amplify that light. Polished stone, metallic fixtures, reflective floors, mirrored walls. Not just beauty, but redirection, concentration. As if the interior spaces were designed to do something with all that incoming light beyond simple illumination. And then there are the anomalies. Ceiling fixtures with no clear purpose. Glass structures embedded in domes, copper elements that don't support weight, iron rods placed where stress calculations don't require them, ventilation systems that seem over-engineered, wiring conduits installed before electrical grids existed, underground chambers connected to the buildings with no documented function, all positioned with mathematical intent. The late 1800s were obsessed with atmospheric energy, experiments in wireless transmission, research into electrical pressure gradients, the idea that energy could be drawn from the environment itself, Tesla's experiments, Edison's research, dozens of smaller inventors pursuing similar concepts. Some of that research was celebrated, much of it quietly abandoned, or buried. If those earlier structures were designed to interact with energy, light, electromagnetic, atmospheric, then the windows weren't windows at all. They were interfaces, collectors, amplifiers, channels. And then, abruptly, the architecture stops. After the early 20th century, the precision vanishes. Windows shrink, ornamentation disappears, stone gives way to concrete, iron to steel. Buildings become cheaper, faster, less exact, less ambitious. It's not evolution, it's abandonment. As if whatever those structures were designed to do, we no longer knew how, or were no longer allowed to do it. Let's reduce the mystery to its simplest form. Between roughly 1825 and the early years of the 20th century, an extraordinary architectural phenomenon unfolded across the planet. Public buildings, courts, libraries, academies, exhibition halls, government offices rose in cities that had no direct connection to one another. And yet, they followed the same rules. Enormous windows, strict geometric ratios, specific combinations of stone, iron, glass, and copper, ornamentation that appeared excessive, even wasteful, yet repeated with absolute consistency. This happened without global planning bodies, without international engineering standards, without instant communication, without shared contractors, shared suppliers, or shared funding systems, without architectural schools teaching a unified curriculum, without professional organizations coordinating designs. The official explanation claims this was simply how architecture worked at the time. Designers imitating one another, styles spreading organically through books and travel, pattern books circulating, architects visiting other cities and bringing ideas home. But that explanation fails the moment you examine the details. Trends don't obey mathematics. Fashion doesn't replicate itself perfectly across continents. Aesthetic movements don't maintain identical proportions when materials, climates, labor skills, and budgets vary so dramatically. Copies degrade. Details change. Local adaptations occur. That's how cultural transmission actually works. Yet here they did. Buildings in South America mirrored those in Eastern Europe. Structures in Scandinavia matched those in Southeast Asia. Window heights, glass-to-wall ratios, iron profiles, unchanged. As if copied, not inspired. As if someone was checking the specifications. Which leads to an unavoidable question. Who was ensuring this consistency? Who was enforcing these specifications? Or, and this possibility is far more unsettling, what if these architects weren't designing at all? What if they were rebuilding, restoring, replicating what already existed? Following templates discovered in older structures, blueprints inherited rather than invented. Once that idea takes hold, everything shifts, especially when you look at what happens next. After roughly 1910, the pattern doesn't evolve. It doesn't simplify gradually, it ends. New public buildings abandon the massive windows entirely. Proportions change, ornamentation disappears, materials shift toward concrete and standardized steel. Light is no longer treated as a structural or spatial priority. The buildings become functional, utilitarian, cheaper. At the same time, something else happens quietly. The documentation thins. Photographs of construction phases become rare. Contractor records grow vague. Architectural drawings vanish from archives. Permits show conflicting dates. Budgets stop aligning with scale. Names appear once and are never referenced again. Entire construction companies seem to exist only for a single project, then disappear. This isn't isolated, it's systemic. I've examined archives across multiple countries. The pattern repeats with disturbing reliability. Detailed planning documents, public debates, funding approvals, artistic renderings, ceremonial groundbreakings. And then, during the actual construction phase, silence, followed by brief completion reports that omit the very details engineers would want most. How were the foundations prepared? How was the ironwork fabricated? Where did the glass come from? Who supervised the installation? How many workers were involved? What techniques were used? These are basic questions. They should have straightforward answers. They don't. Consider major civic landmarks completed at the turn of the century. We know who proposed them, we know where they were placed, we know how they were celebrated. But the practical reality, how thousands of tons of precisely cut stone, iron, and glass were assembled in impossibly short timeframes, is strangely undocumented, as if the process itself wasn't meant to be scrutinized. And then there's the technological question that refuses to go away. If these buildings represented the height of 19th century engineering, why didn't that engineering advance? Why didn't window spans grow larger? Why didn't iron frameworks become more complex? Why didn't stonework become more refined? Instead, we went backward. Modern construction, even with digital modeling and industrial manufacturing, struggles to replicate window sizes that were routine in the 1880s. Restoration engineers routinely admit they don't fully understand how certain load-bearing glass frameworks function. Joinery methods appear nowhere in manuals. Stress distributions violate modern expectations. Yet, the structures stand perfectly for over a century. These buildings are technological orphans. No clear lineage, no developmental trail, no evolution, just sudden appearance and abrupt cessation. And the most troubling discovery wasn't what I found, it was what I didn't. Where are the comprehensive engineering studies addressing this anomaly? Where are the serious academic inquiries into the global uniformity? Where are the conferences questioning how such coordination occurred without modern infrastructure? Where are the dissertations analyzing the technological regression? Instead, there's silence. A few independent researchers dismissed out of hand, a handful of historians who acknowledge the strangeness but refuse to pursue it, and an overwhelming institutional acceptance of vague explanations that dissolve under pressure: craftsmanship, patience, a different era, better materials, lost techniques. These aren't answers, they're placeholders. And placeholders exist when asking real questions is inconvenient. Which brings us back to the windows themselves. Why were they so large? Light is the obvious answer. Before widespread electrical systems, illumination mattered. Natural light meant productivity. It meant beauty. It meant prestige. But illumination alone doesn't require this level of precision. It doesn't explain the materials, the geometry, the embedded metal systems, the subterranean chambers, the copper elements, the precise alignments. Some suggest energy, atmospheric, electrical, something now forgotten. Others propose functions we no longer recognize because we lack the conceptual framework to see them. Perhaps they were part of a larger system we can't perceive because we're looking at fragments. Or perhaps the truth is even stranger. Perhaps these buildings weren't designed for us at all. they remain, silent, monumental, flooded with light, still standing, still functioning, still inexplicable. We use them as offices, museums, libraries. We walk through them daily. We barely notice them anymore. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe we inherited structures we were never meant to understand. Living inside the remnants of a civilization removed not just from history, but from comprehension. Using buildings whose true purpose has been forgotten, reduced to mere architecture when they were once something more. The evidence has been staring at us this whole time, framed in glass. The deeper this investigation went, the clearer one thing became. We don't know what we think we know. Official history doesn't answer these questions. It avoids them. It redirects. It offers comfortable narratives that don't withstand scrutiny. And when pressed, it falls back on authority rather than evidence. But the buildings remain. The windows remain. The impossible scale, the global uniformity, the unexplained precision, all of it remains. And those massive, impossible windows, perfectly proportioned, globally repeated, quietly watching, remain. Waiting. Not for belief. But, for the moment, we're finally willing to ask why they exist at all.